Hey, I'm Casey, and this is Jams, a channel where I talk about a new piece of music every single week. This week, we're talking about Hayley Williams' debut solo album, Petals for Armor. So this album is 15 tracks, it lasts about 55 minutes, and like I said, it's Hayley Williams. And if you don't know who Hayley Williams is, first of all, where have you been? I mean, wasn't she like the token person for your emo phase in middle school? And second of all, where have you been? Hayley Williams is the frontwoman, songwriter, lead singer of the band Paramore, and they're currently on a hiatus, and then she released this solo album. It was released May 8th of 2020, meaning that this album is a Taurus. And I will say that given how the album sounds in its very like earthy kind of vibe, not to mention the fact that it's literally called Petals for Armor, I feel like this album is pretty much a Taurus. At least it's an earth sign. So I said that this album sounds kind of earthy, and I know what you're thinking, like what on earth does she mean about that? But what I mean is that every single song on the album has this kind of breathy quality to it. Like you hear a lot of sighing, a lot of gasping, a lot of quick intakes of breath, and just how that sounds combined with the music itself and how heavy of a bass line there is in basically every single song, to me it just comes across very organic sounding, very earthy. Like if this album was to be a color scheme, it would be earth tones. Just with the breathiness and the gasping and the intakes of air, it seems very organic, coming from the body, and very earthy, which I think is a cool sound to bring across, because given that this is her first solo album, her first kind of big project away from Paramore, I'm sure a lot of people were wondering what was going to happen. I mean, I was wondering, my best friend, who's the biggest fan of Paramore, was wondering, because, I mean, Paramore themselves, they've been around forever, and they've gone from like the emo music to pop punk to more pop to kind of an 80s synth sound with After Laughter. And they've definitely grown with music, so then when Hayley Williams kind of veers off from it, all of her fans are left wondering, what is she going to bring to the table with this solo album? Is it going to be pop? Is it going to be grungy? Is it going to go back to her roots of like the pop punk kind of emo sound? And oddly enough, she doesn't really do any of it. Like I said, it has that focus on breath and how earthy and organic it sounds. It sounds nothing like anything that she's produced before, which I give her a lot of props for, because I'm sure it's very nerve-wracking after having the discography that Paramore has to then put out something that sounds completely different, basically doing an entire 180 on her whole career. And with that kind of breathy, earthy tone in the album, I think it does her a huge service, because then the entire album is just showcasing her voice, and she has an absolutely incredible voice. It's almost otherworldly, really. So I think she definitely made a smart move going towards the kind of sound that she did, because not only is it simple enough that you can showcase your own voice to, but it sounds nothing like she's done before. So obviously it's gonna make a statement. And I will be extremely honest, because I don't want every single video of mine to be me gushing about how much I love the album that I'm talking about, which like most likely it will be, because I love a lot of music, so sue me. I wasn't crazy about the singles that she released off of this album. I thought that they were super different to anything that she's done before, like I said, which is a good thing, and I definitely commend her for it, but I think that the singles that she chose were so out there that it was almost kind of hard to understand what she was going for. So the first single off of this album was Simmer, and when I first heard it, like I said, it was completely different to anything else that she's done before, but for some reason I just couldn't get on board with it, because I feel like it came really out of left field. And I'm not saying that the smart decision would have been to pick a song off of the album that sounds more like what she did with Paramore, because it's clear that she didn't want to do anything that sounds remotely like her previous work. So I'm not saying that that's the solution, it's just that personally for me, which I am biased because I have been a fan of Paramore for a long time, it just kind of came out of left field. I was kind of confused as to what to expect off of this album. I feel like Simmer was a very interesting choice, and I'm not saying that there was a better choice out there, I'm just saying from like a fan's perspective, it was a little confusing. It put me off a little bit. I wasn't really sure if I was looking forward to this album as much as I thought I was going to. So now getting into the actual album itself, Simmer definitely does set the tone for the album, which I think is why it's the first song in the entire album. it definitely makes the bold statement right out of the bat that she's not producing anything similar to what she's produced before, which I do think is good. It's just Simmer wasn't necessarily for me. So I was listening through the whole album, as I do for all of these videos, and I found that the quality of it was just very interesting. And I was just talking to my mom about this, and I was trying to put it into words, but I couldn't put it into words well enough for her to understand, so hopefully I can make you understand what I'm saying. There's an aspect to this album that feels invasive on the listener's part. Like, this album sounds so deeply personal in a way that I have not heard before. And I understand at the same time, I am 23, I have only listened to so much music, but I find that a lot of albums that are supposed to be the singer-songwriters, like, personal stories, they tend to be stuff that, like, you listen to it and it has snippets of, like, personal details in it, but overall you're like, oh, I understand, I've been there, and you think about, like, your own connections to it. Whereas I was listening to this album and it felt like I was listening to someone vent about all their problems, all their heartbreak, everything bad that they're going through, but in a way that felt a little invasive on my part, like I wasn't supposed to be listening to it. Which is so interesting because it's an album, so obviously people are supposed to be listening to it. But I think given how personal it is and how it's coming from just her, it just felt a little invasive on my part. Like I wasn't supposed to hear all of this stuff, but somehow I was. Something that I try to compare it to is like a poetry slam, or like when those like smoky cafes have like poetry night and then one girl goes up and she starts doing her piece about like a breakup, and it's coming from such a personal point in her that you're almost like, should I be listening to this? Because it's so raw and so real, which I think is so interesting because I feel like we don't get something this raw very often. There are breakup songs on this album, definitely, but they seem like they're striking such a chord in Hayley Williams that we can hear it through the headphones or whatever we're listening to it through. In short, what I'm getting at is that this album sounds so raw and it seems like it's coming from such a deep nerve in Hayley Williams that you almost feel a little bit guilty listening to it because you're like, should I be hearing everything that she's saying? Like, should I really be privy to all this information? And I mean, obviously she's putting it out to the public, so like she's fine with it, but it's so raw and so real to her that it's almost like she's in front of you telling you these stories and you're seeing it visibly strike a nerve in her, which I think is cool. I think we don't get that a lot. What I think is really interesting about this album is that a lot of the songs do sound pretty similar in terms of how they're structured. Like the first half of the album definitely kind of meshes together, and what I think is good about that is that it doesn't mesh together in a way that you're like, wow, all these songs sound the same, but it meshes together in a way that it kind of lulls you into her like speech pattern, into her voice, into the melodies of the songs, into the instruments. It's a very mellow experience listening to the first bit of those songs. Like Simmer and Leave It and Cinnamon all kind of mesh together, but not in a way that you're like, oh my gosh, all these songs sound the same. They all bring something different to the table, but it's clear that there's a motif running through all of them. And I think that it's cool that she manages to make it present in a way that lulls you rather than bores you. And at least in my experience, what I think is interesting about the whole lulling aspect is that a lot of the songs cover a huge range of things, like heartache, falling out of love, being a woman, failing, coming into your own. Deals with a lot of subjects, but you get so lulled into her voice, it's almost like you don't really know until you listen to it again, or you hear a lyric that kind of strikes a nerve in you, because otherwise you're just kind of listening to how nice these songs sound and how mellow and melodic everything sounds and how great her voice is, that you almost don't really know what all these songs are about until you give it a second listen, or like I said, you hear a lyric that strikes a nerve in you. Like I was listening to Creepin and I was really lulled into how that sounded and the beats and the bass, but then there was this lyric that I kept hearing that was keep sucking on the memory of him, and I was like, what? And so then I had to listen to it again to find out what it was about. I just think that it's really interesting that she managed to make an entire album that is almost hypnotic, to the point that you don't even know what's happening to you. You don't even know what you're experiencing until you hear that like snap that strikes a nerve in you and you're like, oh my gosh, that's what we're talking about. Because it is kind of a breakup album without you realizing it. A lot of the songs deal with heartache and falling out of love, but you're listening to it and you're so hypnotized by her voice and the bass and the instruments and the breathing. It's extremely hypnotic, and you might not know what she's singing about until there's 30 seconds left of the song, and then you have to go back and listen to it all over again because you feel like you missed something, but you are so enraptured by her vocals and the music that it's not even like a bad thing. And that whole like hypnotic kind of deal brings me back to how interesting I think it is that she included so much breath in this album. You hear her inhales, her exhales, her gasps, her intakes of breath. Like, you hear it all in the album. And that's not something that you usually hear in a lot of music. And so I think that that definitely helps in the whole kind of like hypnotic experience of listening to this album, because you hear a lot of like, and it just really like captures you almost immediately. And something that while I was listening, I noted was that a lot of the songs seem to, the order that she put them in, they seem to be extremely sad in the beginning. And then you end with Crystal Clear and Watch Me While I Bloom. So it's almost like you're getting the progression of someone climbing out of a really bad place, which I think is why it feels almost invasive to listen to, because people's like mental health journeys, or even if you don't want to use such extreme terminology, someone coming out of a dark place is such a personal journey. And usually I think with art we get the before when they're in the bad place and we get the after when they're out of it, but we don't always get the journey in the middle. And that's what Hayley Williams is giving us. And I think that's why it feels invasive, because we don't usually get the first-hand glance at that journey from point A to point B. Did you like that? Did you like watching me figure out what I meant by that? Putting all the pieces together. My mind, guys. Something else. And so now I want to talk about the title of the whole. So what I initially thought about it was that it's kind of like explaining how the album comes across. Like, you get these melodic, mellow songs that lull you into a hypnotic state, and they're soft and they're easy to listen to, and they're easy to just like allow yourself to fall into this trance, but they're about such tough things. So I think that it's definitely an interesting choice to have the title of the album be Petals for Armor, because it's almost like acknowledging that you're talking about all the tough things, but with the grace and the elegance and the softness of the earth, which is why it's a Taurus. Very earthy. So I had a lot of very confusing feelings about this album, but it didn't make me not like it. This album is an experience, is what I'm getting at. And I feel like I have not listened to an album that made me feel this conflicted, but not in a bad way, in an extremely long time, if ever. Like, I feel like a fly on the wall witnessing her growth from a bad point to a pretty okay point. Like, I feel like a fly on the wall witnessing a woman who has fallen completely, struggled to stand back up, and is finally like shakily on her feet by the end of the album. Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. So now we get to the coveted question of how do I rank these songs, and it was very hard to rank them because of that kind of hypnotic thing that I've mentioned incessantly, but this is how I rank the songs. 15 of them. Had a lot of choices. It was 55 minutes, so I really mulled this one over. I did put the more upbeat ones first because I'm a sucker for an upbeat song, but like all of them are really good in their own way. They're very poetic and they're deeply personal, so I commend her for putting something out that is so vulnerable. And now we get to the second coveted question of why did I put that song as number one? So number one for me is Dead Horse, because I feel like it is the moment where everything kind of clicked for me in the album, where I understood more of what it was about, I understood more of where it was coming from, where it was going, and also because it has a voice memo in the beginning of it, of her talking about like this bad place that she's been in, and I'm such a sucker for like voice memos and personal like anecdote kind of things like that, like phone calls, voice memos, voicemails, all those kinds of things. I love laughter. Oh my gosh, I love when it's in songs. So obviously I had to put that as number one because I adore any time that stuff happens. But I also think that if you want to know what this album is kind of about and where it comes from, where it's going, and what the general sounds are, I think Dead Horse is definitely the good way of like dipping your toe into it before starting, if you haven't heard any of the singles before. So that was Petals for Armor. I gotta admit, I did not see it coming. I did not even think that I was really gonna like it when I first heard Simmer, but Hayley Williams, I should always trust. She definitely did surprise me, but it's hard not to commend such a personal and raw piece of art. She gave me such a unique listening experience without having to do anything besides just put out an album. Like there was no like visuals or anything else like that, like nothing fancy. It was just her breathing, and some really melodic, simple sounding, but obviously a lot of work went into it, but simple sounding music that just lulled me into a hypnotic state, and that's an experience I haven't, I think, ever had. So I really have to commend her on that, even though I admit I was very skeptical at first. So that's Petals for Armor. I am curious as to whether or not she's going to put out another solo thing before going back to Paramore, but if she does, I will definitely be eager to see what else she comes up with, because this was already a complete 180 to anything that she's done before, and it didn't even like meet my expectations, because it was like, if my expectations were here, what she produced was like in another room. You can't even compare them. So extremely interesting. If she does put out any other solo work, I will definitely be eager to hear what that's going to sound like. But I hope you enjoyed. Let me know if you've listened to the album. Let me know if you agree with my rank, if you disagree, anything like that. And you can email me if you want me to review any kind of album. You can follow me on social media. That'll all be in the description. And if you want to hear me talk about a new piece of music every week, why not subscribe? It'd make my day. And I hope you enjoyed. And I will see you all next week. Bye.